In our last session, we have seen about the how business game technique in the training that plays a very important role, and the second was exercise which we have done, and that was about the role playing. Now, the third session which we will be talking today, and that is about the behavior modeling, that is the how behavior modeling is important as a training technique. Now, we have to keep in mind that is first we have to understand the difference between the role playing and behavior modeling. In the last module which we have talked about the role playing, and in that case it was the particular character they have to play, like for example a manager. So, then in that case they have to play the role of a manager, but when we talk about the behavior modeling, then we talk about a particular person. Now, these particular training sessions are planned on the basis of the same. First I will give the conceptual part of this behavior modeling, then there will be the demonstration by our students for this particular behavior modeling, and then there will be observer, and observer will talk about that is the how behavior modeling is there. So, while conducting the training program, we have to take certain trainees. So, these trainees will be invited, and these trainees will be play a behavior model, and then there will be one observer amongst these participants, and then he will give his comment, and finally the resource person, that is a faculty, that will give his comment. So, like this we have to conduct this particular behavior modeling program. Now, for this purpose we will talk about that is the how this important session that will be done by this particular behavior modeling. Now, in this behavior modeling we have to find out that is the how these sessions which are going to be conducted, are they reflecting the same behavior, or they are reflecting in the different behavior. If their behavior is different, and then what is expected. So, this can be demonstrated on the basis of the theoretical concepts, and with the help of the theoretical concepts we can talk about that is the how behavior modeling that can work. So, first we have to understand the definition and concept of the behavior modeling. So, behavior modeling presents trainees with a model who demonstrates key behaviors to replicate and provides trainees with the opportunity to practice the key behaviors. For example, a very simple example is of a manager, or another example is of a team member, or another example is of that is how to play an inspiring role. Then in that case that particular behavior is to be demonstrated, so the trainees can learn. So, learners by the pedagogy system, they learn about through the lectures only, they understand the concept, but when we actually demonstrate the behavior, so then the learning becomes an active learning, and which is the basic concept of the conducting the training programs. To demonstrate this active learning, it becomes important that is the how behavior modeling technique is to be used. So, behavior modeling is based on the principles of social learning theory. Now, what is a social learning theory? Social learning theory is emphasizing on two factors. First is observation of behaviors demonstrated by a model. Another example I would like to take, and that is of a family. In family, the child learns the behavior from the parents. So, a boy child many times he is tried to demonstrate the behavior like father, and the girl child demonstrate the behavior like a mother, and therefore, in that case they observe. Now, we have to also understand this observation, this social learning theory may not be the direct, it can be indirect also. So, similarly in the family, the parents have to be very careful. They have to understand that is knowingly or unknowingly their behavior is observed by a child and then adopted also. The similar thing happens at the workplace also. When a manager, a leader or a trainer, whatever the behavior knowingly or unknowingly is demonstrated, that has been observed by the employees, the followers, the colleagues, by the surrounds at the workplace, and then they follow it also. So, if like in leadership we have talked about, that is a participative style of leadership. So, they are observing that is during taking a particular decision, then you invite all the stakeholders, all the concerns, all employees, and then you discuss with them and then you take the decision. So, therefore, in that case that is a particular behavior that they observe and then they follow that, and like this the culture of the organization builds, like a culture of a family builds. Second is that is a vicarious reinforcement. Now, whenever we are talking about this, I have talked about the positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. When we talk about the positive reinforcement, we are talking about the giving the incentives and rewards. For example, the study. So, when you ask a child to study and then you will make a reward, then definitely he will be showing that particular behavior. But in this positive reinforcement, we have to also see that is it should be fixed or it will be interval, and then it should not be the source of motivation, that is the only source of motivation, in the sense that is if you will give the reward then only behavior will be demonstrated. The day you will stop the rewards, the behavior will not be demonstrated. So, this particular challenge is there with this particular behavior modeling technique. Now, it is when a trainee sees a model receiving reinforcement by using certain behaviors, as I mentioned, positive and negative, fixed or that will be through interval, and it has to be carefully crafted, because the culture which we want to build through the behavior modeling, then in that case every time behavior cannot be associated with rewards, and it should not be. It should be a part of practice, it should be part of routine. If it is not a part of practice and routine, then it will be looking for that unless and until there is not a stimulus, the behavior will not be repeated. But there should not be a this conditioning stimulus, that is the only in that case stimulus the behavior will be demonstrated. The behavior modeling is more appropriate for teaching skills. So, whenever a trainer he is going to conduct a particular training session, then how he teaches, that becomes very very important. And behaviors, that is the how a teacher behaves in the classroom for teaching factual information, whatever information he is having, how he is sharing, and for that purpose this behavior modeling. So, for a trainer, when a trainer gives the training program, then rest of the trainers, the learners, the trainees, they also try to adopt that particular behavior. Research suggests that behavior modeling is one of the most effective technique. So, therefore, you can understand the importance of this behavior modeling, that is how important and most effective technique is there for the teaching interpersonal and computer skills. A very good blend of the management and the technology, and whenever we talk about that is the through behavior person learns, that is how he should have a interpersonal relationship, he learns that particular behavior, and then simultaneously he is also learning those technical skills like computer skills are there. So, therefore, in both the cases where it is technology oriented or it is management oriented, in both the cases that technique is used. Well prepared behavior modeling. Now, we play the different roles and there should not be the role conflict. So, as soon as we enter into the workplace, as soon as we put the biometrics and we enter into the workplace, then we try to play a role of an employee, and therefore, it is expected that is you will behave like an employee. An employee behavior is to be associated with the OCB, organizational citizenship behavior. It means that he has to show that particular behavior which is demanded by the profession. So, a professional behavior is expected, and this professional behavior's rights, duties and fundamentals are described in the constituents of the organization, the rules and regulations of the organizations, in the culture of the organization, in the practices of the organization. So, therefore, in that case that then one has to prepare for that. So, a question will arise, can there be a difference of behavior at home and at workplace? And the answer is yes, there has to be, because at home you are playing a role of a father, role of a brother, role of a son, but at the workplace you are playing a role of an employee, and therefore, in both the places, in all the roles, there should not be role conflict and there should be the role justification, and that role justification is possible only whenever we are talking about the preparation. We have to prepare ourselves, we have to train our brain and mind, that is where we are and what type of behavior is associated. And then because it is not only our choice, it is the demand of the surroundings, and therefore whether it is a family, what will be the demand of surroundings? Demands of the surroundings will be from the parents, from the brother, from the children, from the spouse. Similarly, at the workplace, what will be the demands? Demands of the surroundings by the superior, by the colleagues, by the subordinates, and therefore in that case we have to fulfill those demands with well preparation. So, if somebody asks that is through the training can we develop the behavior? Yes, because what we are doing? We are preparing the trainee to behave in a particular way, and therefore well prepared behavior modeling training programs identifies the key behaviors, and while playing these particular roles, then the person learns that there will be whether he is fully prepared or he is not fully prepared. If he is fully prepared, right, because he has trained the brain, his brain is trained in a particular way, in a particular role, a particular behavior, in a particular character by a particular person. So, therefore, in that case it is identifying the key behaviors. Create the modeling display, that is very nice. We all are, Shakespeare says that we all are actors, right. So, life is a drama. So, therefore, in that case what is that? It is reality or it is imaginary? No, it is a reality. Reality is infinite, that is another thing, but in that case we find that is this modeling display has to be done very effectively. So, on the stage of the life, the drama which we play, that is the roles which we play, right, then those roles are to be played very efficiently and effectively. Provide opportunities for practice, but nobody can perfect you in a day one. So, therefore, in that case again and again that situation arises every day. For employees it is not new, that is in his particular position, designation, in his particular character, the situation will keep on arising to ask him, okay, play this role, there will be always demand, and then by practicing day by day the person will try to become perfect, and in these efforts of making the perfection, the training plays a very important role through the technique of the behavior modeling. And facilitate transfer of training. Now, this behavior, please accept this particular concept, that is this demonstration by the seniors, this demonstration by the parents, this demonstration by the superior, that should facilitate the transfer, that what is expected behavior. If it is not transferred, then in that case whole efforts and all the resources, your main machine, material, money, method, minutes, your time means that all will be wasted. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is you facilitate the transfer of training. Then how to developing the behavior modeling? The first step in developing behavior modeling training program is to determine the tasks that are not being adequately performed due to the lack of skill or behavior. Now, you see, like when we talk about a management trainee or graduate engineer trainee, then in that case, that is the first we have to define that particular task. If it is not adequately performed, it may be it is because of the inexperience. Person is not experienced. A person is not experienced, so he will be having the lack of skill or behavior because he does not know, and therefore you value for that particular experience and exposure. So, therefore, you keep on facing the challenging situations and then solving those problems, and they are developing the skills and developing that particular behavior. The success and failures are part of life, which are the giving a lesson at the end. What we learn? We learn that is the what behavior was expected, and we are the self judge whether we have justified that behavior or not. because time has to keep on going, but whether now you cannot bring that time back, and then what was your behavior in a given time? Was it appropriate? If you were the facilitator on the role of, now here is very important thing I would like to mention. When we are playing a behavior, that time we have to understand the role demands, that clarity is required, and for that role demand it is very important, that is the understanding of that particular these skills, what skills and what behavior. Please basically if you do not know that is the what behavior is expected from my role, that clarity is not there, or that exposure is not there, that experience is not there. So, please take training and learn, that is the in a particular given role, even in personal roles parents are taught, that is the what should be your behavior when you are handling a child below 14 years, when you are handling your child between the 14 years to 17 years, and when you are handling your child at the age of 18 and above. So, Shodasha Varshe Prapte Putra Mitra Samachare. So, therefore, in that case it is a lesson for behavior, that what should be the behavior and what should be the skill, and therefore, I always talk about that is the technical skills, human skills, conceptual skills, all these skills, analytical skills if we talk professionally more, consulting skills nowadays, right. So, therefore, all these skills that should be learned, and therefore, that if their tasks are not being adequately performed, may be because of the lack of that skill and behavior. So, please be very careful that whenever we talking about the society, then in the society or in the organization is also part of the society. Whenever we talk about all these aspects, that time we should be very clear, that is the there should be a table, what skills are required, what behavior is required, and that is why you conduct the orientation program. The second part, the key behaviors that are required to perform the task, benchmarking practices. Whenever we are using the case studies, I have demonstrated in earlier module, that is the how the case study that becomes important, how to write the cases, how a trainer should analyze the case, and he should take a sessions on the case study analysis and interpretations. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is that behavior is required to perform, that list is to be there. One should be very careful in making the list. Any particular essential skill, essential behavior, that should not be erased, that has to be exist in that your list. What is the key behavior? A key behavior is one of a set of behaviors that are necessary to complete a task. A simple example is, that is a role of a leader, a behavior of a leadership. A superior, what he should be? He should be leader. What a leader's behavior should be? A facilitator, a vision provider. So, therefore, in that case, if you are clear with that particular key behavior, then definitely in that case you will be able to demonstrate that behavior. In behavior modeling, key behaviors are typically performed in a specific order for the task to be completed, and therefore, in that case there should be goal and there should be the action. So, when you are playing a particular behavior modeling, you should know what is the goal, what we are trying to achieve, what we are trying to demonstrate, and then accordingly we have to perform. Key behaviors are identified through a study of the skills from these case studies, the past experiences. Life itself is a good book to learn the skills and behaviors. That time I have behaved like this and then I got the success. So, that is the repetitive behavior, positive reinforcement. So, repetitive behavior, but that time I failed, it was a blunder. Then I will not behave in a that way again, and because there was a punishment, or there might be the corrective action. As a trainer, I would say that is there were corrective action was taken, it means I was wrong. So, therefore, in that case those type of a study of the skills and behavior necessary to complete the task and goal, and the skills or behavior used by employees who are effective in completing the task. Now, here I would like to also aid, that is whenever we are talking about the effectiveness, and effectiveness comes through the productivity, adaptability and flexibility mod scale, and therefore in that case it is very much required when we talk about the managerial effectiveness, that is this type of the productivity, output, quantity and quality both, and then flexibility with the situation. Okay. Now, it is one more point I would like to mention here, that is the situation plays a very great role in behavior modeling. In the same situation, the behavior changes. Many times you find that is your colleague who was your friend, sometimes he is not cooperating now. So, what has changed? Situation is changed. And so many times you find that is your colleague, those who were not helpful, after so many years he starts helping to you. What is changed? Situation is changed. So, therefore, it is very difficult to understand, that is the whenever we are talking about the behavior modeling, the parameter of the situation you please keep in mind. In which organization you are, what is the organization culture, what is that particular situation, how in a given situation these behavior of the characters will keep on changing. Whenever there will be the favorable situation, then there will be this particular task will be there, but whenever there will be unfavorable situation, then there will be the no task. So, therefore, who are effective in completing the task, that becomes very important. The development of general key behaviors promotes far transfer. So, therefore, it becomes very important, that is these particular general key behaviors, the listing of the key behaviors, that is important. When you are having the listing of the key behaviors, then only you can transfer. That is, trainees are prepared to use the key behaviors in a variety of situations. As I mentioned, that is the word of situation, it becomes very important. Whenever there is a situation, and then the situation many times direct the behavior. So, be careful, that is the how to be. I have discussed with you in earlier module about the Fiedler's model, and therefore, that relationship task and position at professional role, that becomes very important. Whenever we are talking about that behavioral task and role, then that becomes an important role whenever we are talking about a situation. So, your relationship in a given situation, that is becoming very important. So, therefore, this understanding of the development of general key behavior, at that time you have to keep in mind the situation. Second important consideration in developing behavior modeling programs is the modeling display. Now, you know how to behave, but are you able to display that behavior or not, that is also very important, and therefore, the personality plays a very important role, and an effective personality will be able to demonstrate that particular behavior in the modeling display. That is while that particular behavior when the particular behavior is demonstrated, and that time the person's personality is enough competent to demonstrate that particular behavior. So, this change of personality and playing this role or this acting, right, but acting will not be the right word, because that has to be in the reality, and then that particular in a given reality, that particular playing a role, shifting of role, then that becomes the very important of an individual's personality. And if individual's personality is competent enough in the modeling display, then definitely he will be the very much successful in behavior modeling. The modeling display provides the key behaviors that the trainees will be practiced to develop the same set of behaviors. Videotape is the predominant method used. Now, whenever earlier it was the videotape word has been used, but now you will see in the next module I will be demonstrating with the help of this digital pedagogy. So, nowadays when we are talking about the digital pedagogy, that is the predominant method used. Many people are learning the qualitative skills and behavior or the quantitative skills through with the help of the YouTube and all, and media is playing a very great role, and therefore, this technology, that is the predominant method to use to present the modeling displays. So, if somebody wants to develop and practice, then definitely he can take the use of the technology in displaying this particular behavior modeling and learn from that. Although computerized modeling displays are also being used, and therefore that can be also we can use through the computerized modeling also, that can be used. Now I will come towards the application of this particular planning. So what is to be prepared? As I mentioned that in the behavior there is a need for this particular behavior modeling, and in application planning prepares trainees to use the key behavior on the job. So preparation and plan for the preparation. The trainer, when this like this here behavior modeling, we have prepared our students, and then we have given them that particular script, and then asked them that is the yes they have to make their this particular behavior. So the trainer has to prepare that particular script, and then it has to help the trainees while giving a particular situation, that is what they will be able to demonstrate. So trainer first has to make that preparation, and that is called the application planning, which enhances the transfer of training. So transfer of training will be enhanced with the help of this particular preparation. So as I mentioned, that is during training program the trainer should make a proper application of the planning. Second, application planning involves having all participants prepare a written document, and therefore that written document that has to be ready identifying the specific situation and in which they should use the key behaviors. Now what can be the source? Source can be either we are making the use of the textbooks, or we are making the use of the journals, or making the use of the different case studies, and then we can make the use of the different dramatic scenarios. We can use the different news also, paper news also, that we can take and make the source for this particular application of planning, and then that can be involved. Some training programs actually have trainees complete a contract outlining the key behaviors they agreed to use on the job, and therefore this trainee that contract outlining that has to be very important. What they can do, that is this the key behavior they agreed to use on the job, that contract is made, and then on basis of that contract, because that contract will remind, that contract will be always reminding the person, no, I have to behave in a particular way, and therefore that type of contract can be there. However, there can be the breach of contract, and then breach of contract is there, then corrective action is required. That the corrective action will be required, and trainer has to inform, that is no, this behavior was required to be in a particular way. The trainer may follow up with the trainees to see if they are performing according to the contract, and therefore whatever the behavior has been explained to the trainees and the script has been given, that whatever preparation is made, that has to be informed on the basis of that particular contract. As part of the application planning process, a trainee may be paired with the another participant, because it is a behavior modeling. So definitely he has to demonstrate one behavior in coordination with the another participant, with the stated expectation that the two should periodically communicate with each other to discuss success and failures in the use of the key behaviors, and then we have to ask the participants, that is the what is their experience, and on basis of their experience they will be trainees will be talking about, that is what has been, what they have thought of and what they wanted to behave, and whether they have behaved or they have not behaved in that way, and therefore they can make the use of the key behaviors and discussion, that is whether they have performed or not. So what are the activities in a behavior modeling training program? Watch video that presents key behaviors, listen to rationale for the skill module, that is what is the skill module is there, and discuss the experiences in using skills, and therefore if they are able to do these experiences, whatever experience is there, they have to make the use of those skills. What will be the skill preparation and the development? They will be the viewing the model, participate in role plays and practices, and then show the particular behavior by playing a particular role, receive oral and video feedback. Like here we will give the feedback, observer will give the feedback, the trainer will give the feedback, that what behavior modeling has been demonstrated on performance of the key behaviors. So how to make a preparation? set improvement goals. Then after this, that is the where there was a scope of improvement, that improvement is to be there. Identifying the situations in which to use the key behaviors where they have demonstrated proper behavior. Identify on the job application of the key behaviors, and what is the on the job the key behavior is required to be performed. And in that case we will talk about this particular behavior modeling. Then we will talk about the uses of phone at work. These are the certain videos. Then they will talk about that is the what is the right way. You will see this picture, that is the how the employee that is supposed to behave in a then the sincerity and hard work. These are the situations. This is all about the certain examples, and now with the help of my MBA students I will like to demonstrate that is the what is the behavior they are supposed to demonstrate. Then they themselves will be giving their feedback, that is what is how they were made the successful behavior, or there were some failure, why it is so. The observer will comment, then I will comment, and like this we will conduct the training program on behavior modeling. Thank you.